Preparation for Brother Caleb's lesson, I'll be reading from the 18th chapter of 1 Kings, verses 20 through 24. So Ahab sent orders among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long are you going to struggle with the two choices? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." The people did not answer him, not so much as a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left as a prophet of the Lord, while Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now have them give us 2 oxen, and have them choose the one ox for themselves, and cut it up, and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox, and lay it on the wood, and I will not put fire under it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people replied, "That is a good idea."
If you haven't already, go ahead and open to 1 Kings chapter 18. We will be in that chapter for the majority of the lesson this morning. I do want to thank you for having me yet again. I know it's been a couple months as usual, but it's a little bit colder now than it was last time, but I'm actually quite appreciative of that. Some of us get a little bit warmer in Sunday clothes than others, and I'm definitely one of those people that God said, hey, maybe sweating will humble you a little bit. And so I appreciate the cool weather and makes it a little bit more nicer outside. And, but it is good to see all of you guys, and I'm grateful each time I get to be here. And, you know, I recently, I turned 30 years old last month. And so, you know, I don't get the senior discount yet, but it's on the horizon. But, you know, I started thinking about stuff more often. You think about how time passes a lot quicker. And one thing I always didn't appreciate growing up was my grandfather, where I went to church for, the first several years of my life before we moved up here near into Brownsburg. He would always generally do the announcements. We'd always have some elder at the church do announcements. And he would always go on long-winded announcements where you're just like, all right, wrap it up. We're going to miss, we're going to miss lunchtime if we let this go. But I started to realize just this genuine appreciation that he had to be at services with members of the church each Sunday. And you could just see that joy kind of come out of him. And, it's something I will admit I haven't always felt that same kind of way, that same appreciation for it. It's just something that's easily taken for granted, but we are very blessed. I know you are in this congregation. I know I feel that way visiting here with you, and then I know obviously at my own congregation, I feel very blessed to have the people in my life that I do. And so it is a good thing for us to worship together this morning. I wanted to talk about 1 Kings chapter 18 and this situation at Mount Carmel, because there's a couple of things that I think are interesting that kind of come out of this. And part of the lesson I want to do this morning is kind of building us to that kind of climactic scene and what the whole purpose of this chapter really is. And really, you can only get to that by first establishing the setting of the story. All right. In a lot of ways, 1 Kings has a very similar pattern, all right, where each king is introduced in a line or a phrase very simply to describe them. And everything else that is detailed about them is pretty much in support of the initial statement that's given to them. So-and-so became king in his place, and they did, fill in the blank. It's either evil in the sight of the Lord, or they followed in the ways of their father David. And it pretty much keeps a consistent pattern with that. And here in chapter 18, we start getting this key relationship between Elijah and Ahab. And Ahab is one of those kings that our first description of him is not a good one. he is described as someone who did evil in the sight of the Lord. And his father before him, whose name was Omri, it said, did evil, greater than any of the kings before him, who did evil and was detestable by God, far worse than any king before him. And then Ahab exceeded him in that. It says, Ahab exceeded him and provoked the Lord to anger more than all the kings that came before him. And so this is how Ahab is initially described. And we're given this introduction to who he is and kind of part of his nature. And in chapter 17, part of that anger that is provoked out of the Lord has led to a drought in the land of Israel. God has ceased the rains falling. He has been provoked to anger to such an extent that now he is going to eliminate the growth. He is going to eliminate the prospering of the land, causing the brooks to dry up, causing it to the point where Ahab is going to go out with one of his advisors, Obadiah, and he is going to say, hey, you go this direction, I'm going to go this opposite direction, and we're just going to find any blade of grass that we can find for the sake of our animals. Like, that's the desperate situation that they are in with this drought. And I believe the drought lasts over 3 years. But in chapter 18, when we start up this scene, God comes to Elijah and basically, gives him a message that he needs to go bring to Ahab. All right, he wants him to go show himself to Ahab. And kind of the last part of setting up this scene, and I mentioned a lot of this chapter is about setting up this relationship between Ahab and Elijah. And there's this interaction that they have in the first few verses of chapter 18 where we see how Ahab views Elijah and how Elijah views Ahab. And with these certain circumstances that they're in, with this drought and the suffering of the land and the crops and the, obviously the livestock going to be suffering and the people as well, Ahab, his first interaction with Elijah describes in verse, I believe I've lost it. Later on in the verse, after he's met with Obadiah and Elijah and Ahab meet, verse 17. In verse 17, Ahab saw Elijah, and Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, in your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So just kind of setting the tone with this interaction that, Austin just read for us, that's about to set stage in verse 20, or in verse 20 onward of chapter 18. We have these two men who are in this very dire circumstances with the rain being, not showing up for a number of years now. And each of them basically meets each other, and the first thing they say is, "It's your fault," right? He comes up to Elijah, and Ahab says, "Hey, it's you troubler of Israel. You're the one causing all the problems." And obviously, Elijah responds more directly with, "No, you're the problem, and here's why you're the problem." And talks about something that's really going to set the tone for the purpose of this chapter, about these Baal worshipers, all right, these prophets that have been brought in. And kind of the last thing I want to say is kind of a background introduction, is probably the biggest key character in this that isn't necessarily directly touched on too much besides right here, is Jezebel. One of the most wicked people we are introduced to in the entire Bible is Jezebel. And she is being described here as someone who has brought in this Baal worship. And it doesn't always say it necessarily directly, but what we have here when it first introduces her in chapter 18, verse 19, and it describes her, it says all of these prophets are reclining at her table. There's a close, intimate relationship she has with them in regards to she is the driving force for why Baal worship has been brought in there. She's a Sidonian, all right? Ahab has married her, and after that, she has, kind of inflicted the land, inflicted the people of Israel with this Baal worship. She has been the driving force of that. And there's plenty of other stories, all right, where you can read about Ahab and Jezebel, and not to say Ahab in any way is an innocent man, but you can see a lot of situations where Ahab, was going to do far less, and Jezebel pushed him to do far worse. Okay, and so in this situation, we see, all right, the infliction of the land with this Baal worship has been spearheaded by Jezebel. Okay, so this is kind of a background character we're not going to touch on a lot today, but she has really been the driving force for why the people of Israel are caught up in this wicked worship of Baal. And so these are the people that Ahab is meant to bring to Mount Carmel. And then we see this popular scene unfolding, which we'll touch on some of the details here. But they go to meet at Mount Carmel. An interesting side note, and this, I've read a couple things about this. It's not, ironclad, have all the evidence in the world, but it's commonly thought that Mount Carmel, the area, the mountains around it, that scene was often used in Baal worship. Okay? So this site, this location that has been chosen by Elijah, where he's telling Ahab to bring these people here, bring these prophets, it's, if we were looking at it in sports terms, the Baal worshipers got the home field advantage, all right? They get to have it at a place where people are already going to worship Baal, all right, where sacrifices are already being made. And so it's also important to note with that, besides the fact this is where Baal worship is being done, we need to note how people viewed Baal. What was Baal actually the god of? What did he do? And part of what Baal was supposed to provide was he was a god of the harvest. He was a god that controlled the weather, the rains. Those things all came from Baal. Kind of ironic in the fact that they're in the midst of this drought, right? So things aren't going super well in that sense. But that's what they believe Baal did. He provides the harvest. He provides the growth, the produce, the sustenance that we need from the crops. That's coming from Baal. That's how it worked. And very common to, read about the Romans or the Greeks and see how they came up with gods for everything, right? And so in this situation, Baal, though, being described as this god of the harvest. And so all of this is key background information that's not necessarily directly touched on here in the story, but it's important to know, and it adds extra context that helps us understand what's going on. After that, all right, after we've set the scene with who are the characters in play, we've got Ahab, we've got Elijah, we've got Baal, who is, this god of the harvest, this god of the rains, this god of the weather, and then, one that we haven't really touched on too much yet, but, we'll certainly talk about more, is God, Yahweh, the Lord. He is also present in this situation. And as was just mentioned, and as was just read by Austin earlier, we saw that Elijah is coming here in verse 21, and he asks the children of Israel a question. All right, because not only are the prophets there, but he has invited Israel to come and lay witness to this. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? Or how long will you question between two opinions? Or how long will you, be, confused?" Or however you want to use the phrasing. I don't know all the iterations and what terms they use directly. I like this term limping about, though. This idea of, movement, but not anything assured, no true conviction is made here. But it also lets us know something that describes the heart of the people right now. And even later on in chapter 19, when you look at Elijah and what follows after this, and his lack of, his loneliness and solitude that he feels after the scene, which we're not going to read or get into, but, we find God saying, hey, there are still people who have not yet, bowed their knees to Baal. They have not bowed down to Baal. And so the people are really caught up in this split, right? There's Baal worship. There's those who haven't given over to Baal. And then, I think a large portion, based on what Elijah is saying here, is there's some who are playing both sides of the fence, okay? There are some who are playing, hey, Baal, I'll take what he's got, and I'll take what God has here, and hopefully that'll work out for the best for me, which is very fitting for, the people in that sense. If things go as, these prophets proclaimed it to be, right? Where, hey, you got to worship Baal because he gives us the sustenance. He gives us the crops. And there's chapters, a few chapters ahead where Israel is going against the Arameans, where we see this phrase how other countries viewed God as, hey, he's a God of the hills. we'll fight them down in the valleys, and God doesn't have the same power there. So it's a very common idea for people to think gods are just a god of a certain thing. There's not a god of everything. There's just gods of certain things. They have limitations on their power. And so it would make sense why maybe the Israelites kind of fall into that same thinking of, oh, well, Baal can do this. We'll take God for these other things that he does, whatever those may be, whatever they may think God's benefits are versus Baal's. But that's probably how the people are interacting here with their gods. Hey, dabble in Baal, dabble in Yahweh, probably dabbling in other things as well. But that kind of shows you why Elijah is so strongly coming out and saying, I'm not even getting on to you about caring about Baal. I'm getting on to you by the fact that you won't just pick a side. Okay? Whether you want to tie that into Jesus' comment about, hey, be hot or be cold, but don't be lukewarm, right? If you want to consider it that way. I mean, essentially, that's what Elijah's saying. Hey, we've got this situation. You won't just pick Baal, and you won't just pick Yahweh. You just want to go back and forth between the two. You want to play both sides, and that's unacceptable. That can't happen. And so Elijah's purpose, we know he's on behalf of God, but his purpose, he doesn't even say is, I'm going to convince you that God's the true God. He says, by the end of this, you're going to know it's either Baal or it's Yahweh. You're going to know it's one or the other. That's the purpose at the end of this, and you'll have to pick. And as we saw in the reading, everybody agrees this is a good idea. This will satisfy the confusion. And so now that we know all of that, now you can get into the scene on the mountain. If you just go into it and we just talk about, and I really don't want to spend too much time even talking about the scene on the mountain, because we've probably read it plenty of times, this idea of the sacrifice and what's accepted. But the people here are torn between two opinions, and how reflective is that of our society today? Because nobody just buys into a principle. I buy into every principle that suits me in that given moment. Okay? I'm all about work when work suits me well. I'm about the church when the church is benefiting me when I need it to. I'm a family man when, they're not driving me up the wall, or, whatever it is. We do what suits us. We pick and choose the elements that we need at that given time. But that's not how true discipleship, that's not how true followers live. That's not how we show true service to God. It's not a pick and choose type of relationship. And so here you have to find total devotion or no devotion at all. And that's what Elijah's asking of the people here when we get into this scene on the mountain. And he's brought everybody to lay witness to it. But in this situation, actually getting to what happens on the mountaintop. All right, we've laid this scene where each of the two sides, Elijah by himself, and then the 450 prophets of Baal, the 400 Asher, they're going to each build an altar, and they'll let them pick which oxen they chop up, put on the altar, things like that. Elijah says, hey, I'll let you guys go first. I'll give you the quote-unquote best time of the day. They'll get all day, essentially. These prophets of Baal will get all day almost to try and get this sacrifice to be accepted. And it's got to be burned up. They can't add any fire to it. Their God has to be able to provide it. But there are a couple things I want you guys to note in verse 26 through 29. All right, how does Elijah interact with these prophets of Baal? So as they're trying to get the prophets are screaming out to Baal to answer them. It says in verse 27, jump back with me to verse 26. It says, and they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And notice this phrase here at the end of verse 26. And they limped around the altar that they had made. Kind of the same phrasing as if we talked about with the people and them limping about these two differing opinions, these two differing gods. And then in verse 27, listen to what Elijah says. At noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. All right. So pretty strong definitive language here in the chapter, basically saying how these prophets, their acts are futile. There's no success whatsoever. The whole purpose is for our God to hear us and answer us. And it mentions there was no answer, no one heard, no one paid attention. But notice what Elijah says. You notice how he describes their God? You notice all the characteristic he puts upon them, upon Baal. First one, he calls Baal a god. He's like, hey, cry aloud, for he is a god. But then he says, perhaps he's musing, meditating on something else. All right? Basically saying he's thinking about something else too hard. He can't possibly focus on you. Seems interesting. Relieving himself. Now, I've read some commentaries where they think maybe that could also mean resting, but I think it's probably like using the restroom. All right? Okay. Maybe he's asleep, needs to wake up. That's why he can't hear you. All right, so these three traits. You notice what any of those three traits have in common? I'm guessing all three of these we've done at some point in time, right? We all have these kind of issues. Does God have those kind of issues? Does God not pay attention because he's thinking about something else? Does God not answer because he's off using the restroom? Or does God not answer because he's asleep and he snores too loud to hear the prayer? Right? Those are all human traits. So while he mocks them saying, hey, you're God, he basically says your God is human at best. Obviously, he's mocking by showing them he's not real at all. But the truth is, he's giving him human traits, right? Your God's human. Your God's just you. Screaming, clawing, scratching yourselves, cutting yourselves, making you bleed. All right, that's you. That's all you have. There's no one there to answer, and it's definitive in that statement. There's no one there answering. There's no one there to pay attention. There's no one there to offer the sacrifice to. All right, and so just quickly going over how Elijah follows that up. He obviously pours water all over his altar, which is kind of significant because we just talked about how the fact that we're in a drought here. So when you talk about using up water and just pouring it over an altar, enough to where it fills the trench around the altar that he digs, that's a lot of water he just used up in the midst of a drought. So he better be right on this, otherwise he just wasted a pretty important resource, right? And then he calls out to God, and God answers, right? And doesn't have much, fancy, doesn't need to cut himself, doesn't need to scream, doesn't need to, be shouting for hours. He offers a prayer to God, and God answers, and he consumes the sacrifice. And so I think the fascinating part is the reaction after this happens. So this obviously shows God is the true God, and the people respond. So Elijah in verse 37, answer me, O Lord, answer me that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. And then it says, the fire fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up all the water that was in the trench. And then the people fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. That was all that Elijah was looking for, is at the end of this, you're going to pronounce your God. You're going to pronounce who is the true God and who you will serve. But this goes back to many years prior. This motivation that Elijah has is meant to go back to many years prior, and kind of the last section that I want to focus on and talk about what was Elijah's real end goal. What is this idea of, choosing your God, choosing whom you're going to serve? It really goes all the way back to Deuteronomy. So just kind of to wrap up the lesson, jump back with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. I'm going to read sections of this chapter. I think this is one of the most significant chapters that is given to us, especially in the Old Testament, because it lays such a foundation for what the people of Israel were meant to be, what they were expected to be. And so a lot of, obviously, Deuteronomy and a lot of the laws that are given, and Moses writes down and is detailing out to the people. But just starting in verse 1 of chapter 6, when we're thinking about what is Elijah's true motivation, what is the significance of this idea of, hey, you must pronounce God, you must choose who your God will be. Who is your God going to be? It goes all the way back to this chapter. And even before that, I guess we could go as well. But there's a lot of key language in chapter 6. It says, now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping his statutes and his commandments, which I commanded you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, this is the key section here, these next few verses. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them when you sit in your house. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And just kind of pausing there for a second. The significance of that section is so important because it is literally the problem with Israel every following book after this one. Every single story that we interact with where we see Israel in trouble, struggling, usually relates to this section where they forget what God has done for them. They forget what the Lord their God has done for them. And we are the same people. We are the same people when we go to a land that is vibrant and productive and rich and beautiful, and we have full cisterns, we have a fridge full of food, when we have houses with electricity and all these things. And Moses is asking us the same thing. Be careful lest you forget. Be careful lest we forget who provided this to you. All right, for the people of Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt? Who got you to this land flowing of milk and honey? And for us, it's the same thing. We talked a lot about, the Lord's Supper today in Bible class, right? Why do we need to do it every week, right? Why do we have to do it every week? Because, we have shown as a people, literally from the beginning, from the very first set of people, that we will forget the commands. We will disregard. We will forget the things God has done for us, and they will fade from mind. And that's what's happened to the people in 1 Kings chapter 18. And that's what happens in that run of kings, where you have all these people who are swayed off by the leadership of their kings, and they forget the ways of David. They forget the ordinances of God. They forget the way in which they were meant to live. And it's supposed to be written on their hearts. It is supposed to be something so ingrained in them that it cannot be forgotten. And here is just a perfect example of it in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. This situation where the people have become so strained in this relationship, where they have lost sight of what God has done for them, that they're looking to other gods. Not that even those that don't totally, disregard Yahweh are only dabbling partially in Yahweh. And then we get some kings that it describes that totally forgot the ways of God. They totally disregarded everything that God had laid out for them. That is the same problem for them, and it's the same problem now. There's not a lot of leaders that I see nowadays in true positions of, authority where I really am sitting there thinking like, yeah, they're really remembering the ways of God, right? We offer those prayers all the time, right? We offer those prayers, and if we were just going based on the evidence we see, I'm seeing it fall on deaf ears. If God is giving them the message, his message is falling on deaf ears, right? I'm not seeing a lot of actions that are reflective of the way in which God wants us to live, right? It's not being shown to be something that has truly been written on the hearts, passed from generation to generation. And that's why I wanted to kind of wrap up the lesson with how it finishes in chapter 6, in verse 20. And this is, I think, this is especially a calling to us as well, all right? And I know parents, you can speak to this better than I can, but I can only speak to how my parents and my grandparents clearly took this to heart, and I'm going to be eternally grateful for it. But this is the responsibility that is on, parents. This is the responsibility on leaders of the family, fathers, mothers, to lead their children. Read in verse 20 with me through the end of the chapter. When your son asks you in time to come, and I think it's important to say this, they will ask you, right? I asked my dad, I asked my grandparents, I asked my mom, I asked them questions about this because when I got older, I began to become more curious about things. Why is this right? Why is this wrong? Why shouldn't I do this? Why shouldn't I do that? And maybe they don't all ask it at the same age. Maybe they don't all ask the same question. But I think Moses is right about writing this here. And I know all of you that have been parents, whose children are old enough, they've asked the question. And you've had to have an answer for it. So I know I can get backed up on this, whether it was when you asked it or when you've heard your kids ask it. But when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there, that they might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as we are to this day. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. I love how it ends there. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God. Why? For our good always. And ultimately that he might preserve us alive as we are to this day. Now I know that's speaking specifically to those people about their deliverance from Egypt, but what in that passage does not pertain to us? How is our preservation any different? We weren't preserved directly from Pharaoh, but we have been preserved from certain death. We have been freed, we have been saved, and the responsibility to have that written on our hearts, and the fathers and the mothers to write that on their children's hearts when they ask them, and to teach them. And yes, ultimately, we as children have to make that decision. Each of us has to make that decision. That's true. But here Moses is saying such an important key thing of, you don't just leave that kid out to the wolves and hope that they eventually find solace somewhere and protection and safety and deliverance, right? The responsibility, not just, I don't even think it just leads to parents, but also, we can even extend that to those of us in the church to help be an influence that can continue to write those impacts on the hearts of the young people in our congregation, right? And we want them to feel a security, a safety, a love, a family nature. We have to show that in all aspects. And the people had lost that over the years. Kings would remove that from the psyche of the people. They would remove that from the culture, and they would lose that nature that God intended them to have as a people. And we can't lose that same type of nature now. All right, we can't be those that also fall into this limping about two differing opinions. And the only way we avoid that is by having the Word of God written on our hearts, having it be into the very fiber of our being. All right, and that's really what Moses is asking them to do. All right, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. All of it ultimately, Moses for the people of Israel at this time, the people during the time of the kings, us now, is for the preservation of life. God is offering this instruction. He is offering this to save us. And it's for our good always. And so, I don't know where each of you are at, and you know, I know I ask that about every time, but it's true, right? We don't know where everybody's at, right? We might have good ideas, but each of us, I believe, has that little tiny part of ourselves that we find very difficult to reveal to anyone, right? It's almost that thing that makes us us and nobody else. And it's important that we do not allow that to keep us from this family, from our true family in Christ. And so, you know, make sure we aren't lipping about two differing opinions. We aren't questioning the solid truths of the gospel. All right? So that's what this, you know, lesson, I'm preaching it to myself, as always, more than anybody else here. But, you know, make sure the Word of God is written on your hearts. As parents, make sure you're writing it on the hearts of your children, right? As members of this body, we should be helping to write that on the hearts of those that we come in contact with here as brothers and sisters, to continue to facilitate and build up a stronger family connection in this body. And so if we do that, I think that shows what the preservation of that in the kings that did follow after God. All right, and it does promote life, and it is for our good always. So thank you for listening to that. If you have any needs at this time, if you need prayers, now is a good time to come forward and make those needs known as we stand and sing.